He said it the way you might mention the weather, standing by the kitchen island in the house I had lived in for 41 years. My son set his coffee down on the butcher block my husband had carved with his own 2 hands, and he told me I had until the end of the month to either clear his wife's $750,000 debt or find somewhere else to live. He did not sit. He stayed on his feet, tall and loose-limbed, the way a man stands when he believes the conversation is already over. I looked at him. I looked at the light coming through the bay window over the sink, the same light that used to fall on my husband's shoulders when he stood there rinsing berries from the garden. I looked at my son's face, and I did not see the boy I had raised. I saw a stranger wearing his skin. I nodded once. That was all. My name is Eleanor, and I was 67 years old the night my only child gave me an ultimatum in the house my late husband and I had built, with our own savings, our own sweat, and more quiet sacrifice than I could ever explain to someone who had never missed a meal so their child could take skating lessons. We lived in a small town about an hour north of Toronto, the kind of place where the maples turn the color of a struck match in October and the neighbors still wave when you drive past. My husband, Thomas, had been an electrician by trade. I had been a school librarian for 34 years. We were not wealthy people. We were the kind of people who clipped grocery flyers, who brought our own tea bags to the cottage, who paid off our mortgage 6 months early because Thomas could not stand the thought of owing anyone anything. When he passed 3 winters ago, I thought the worst thing that would ever happen to me had already happened. I was wrong. My son is named Graham. He is 39. He works in commercial real estate in Mississauga, or at least that is what his business card says. His second wife is named Camille. She is 31. She came into our lives 2 years after Thomas died, and from the very first Sunday dinner, I could tell she did not like the way the roast chicken was cooked, the way the tea was steeped, the way I pronounced the word pasta. She did not say any of this. She did not have to. A woman who has spent her whole life around children learns to read a face the way a sailor reads the sky. When Graham's first marriage ended, he was raw. He had lost his wife, Melissa, to a cancer that took her in under a year, and for a while he could barely get through a phone call without his voice cracking. I opened my door to him. I said, "Come home for a while. Come home and let me make you meals and do your laundry and just be near your mother." He stayed 2 weeks, then 2 months, then 6. By the time he met Camille at some networking event downtown, he was sleeping in his old bedroom, and I was folding his undershirts the way I had when he was 15. Camille moved in before the engagement. She arrived with 4 suitcases, a steamer trunk, and a small dog named Pistachio that she carried in a purse. She told me the guest room would do for now. She asked if the Wi-Fi password could be changed to something easier to remember. She asked if I minded taking my morning coffee in the sunroom instead of the kitchen, because the kitchen light was better for her skincare routine. She asked all of this with a smile so bright it looked painted on. I said yes. I said yes to every single thing. I said yes because my son's eyes finally had some life in them again. I said yes because I remembered being young and wanting to impress a boyfriend's mother. I said yes because Thomas always used to tell me that keeping the peace was worth almost anything, and I missed Thomas so much that his words felt like a commandment. I told myself she was nervous. I told myself she would settle. I told myself a mother's job is to make room. The wedding was small, held at a winery in Prince Edward County. I paid for the catering. I did not ask to. I offered because Camille's parents were not in the picture, and I did not want her to feel the shape of what she was missing. She thanked me by seating me at a back table beside a deaf uncle of someone I had never met. During the toasts, she called Graham her rock, her savior, the man who had pulled her out of a life she did not deserve. She did not mention me. Not once. Not even a thank you for the pork loin. After the wedding, they moved back into my house. I had assumed this was temporary. I had an entire speech prepared about how I was thrilled to help them save for a place of their own, how Thomas and I had done the same thing, living in my mother-in-law's basement in North Bay when we were young, how a year or two of scrimping was the best foundation a young couple could have. I never got to give that speech. The month rolled into a season, the season into a year, and still, Camille's steamer trunk stood in the upstairs hallway like a monument. I noticed things slowly, the way you notice a bruise spreading. I noticed that my coffee mug, the one Thomas had bought me in Halifax the summer we got engaged, disappeared from the cupboard and reappeared in the recycling bin, chipped on the rim, in a way it had never been chipped before. I noticed that the framed photograph of Thomas and me at our 30th anniversary was no longer on the mantel. I found it a week later, in a drawer in the spare room, face down, a glass of red wine sweating a ring on top of it. I noticed that the thermostat in my own bedroom was always a little cooler than the rest of the house, because Camille said the hallway vent was affecting her sleep. I noticed that when Graham came home from work, he kissed her first and asked her about her day, and sometimes he would look up and notice me sitting at the table and say, "Oh, hi, Mom." The way you greet a coworker in an elevator. I said nothing. I was not raised to complain. My mother was a Scottish war bride who crossed an ocean with a baby on her hip and never once said she was homesick, even when I could hear her crying through the bathroom door. I am made of that woman. I swallowed things. Then the packages started arriving. It began with 1 or 2 a week, cardboard boxes stacked by the front door addressed to Camille. Then it was 1 or 2 a day, designer handbags, shoes, skincare in little gold jars that cost more than my weekly grocery bill, a stationary bike that took 2 delivery men to carry up the stairs. I would come home from my volunteer shift at the library, and there would be a tower of them in the foyer, and Camille would be perched on the couch in a robe, slicing open boxes with a letter opener, her eyes bright in a way I had only ever seen in the eyes of people at a slot machine. I asked Graham once, gently, if everything was all right with their finances. I remember exactly how he answered. He did not look up from his phone. He said, "Mom, you don't understand how things work anymore." That was it. That was the whole sentence. He said it the way you might speak to a child who has wandered into the middle of an adult conversation, and something in me went very still. I started watching after that. I started watching the way my mother used to watch the kettle, steady and patient, waiting for the sign. I learned that Camille was not working, and had not worked in the entire time she had lived under my roof. I learned, because she took a phone call in my kitchen without closing the door, that she had walked away from a sales job at a cosmetics counter in Yorkdale nearly 2 years before the wedding, owing a small fortune to a line of credit, a department store card, and at least 2 private lenders I had never heard of. I learned that Graham had co-signed. I learned that the numbers had grown, because the numbers always grow when no one is paying them down. I learned because I sat at my own kitchen table one Saturday morning and quietly opened a piece of mail that had been left on the counter, that the current total owed was just over $740,000. I read that number 3 times. My hands did not shake. I have always been proud of that about myself. I put the letter back. I sealed the envelope with a damp fingertip the way Thomas had taught me to seal a letter when we had to mail something back to the wrong address without the post office noticing. I went into my bedroom, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I let myself breathe for exactly 1 minute. Then I began to plan. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I called Marjorie Lashens, who had been Thomas's squash partner for 18 years before he got sick, and who had come to his funeral in a black coat and handed me an envelope she said I should open only when I was alone. I had opened it that night, expecting a condolence card. What I had found instead was a letter from my husband, written in his careful, blocky handwriting, and a copy of a trust document, I had never seen before. Thomas, my Thomas, had known. He had known that our boy had changed. He had seen things in Graham, in those last months when the morphine blurred the edges of everything else, that he had been too kind to say out loud while he was alive. He had written me a letter asking me to forgive him for the things he had not been brave enough to warn me about in person. He had set up a trust that held the house, the cottage up in Muskoka, and the bulk of our savings, with me as the lifetime beneficiary, and a clause so ironclad that no one could force a sale or a transfer without my explicit written consent. He had named Marjorie as the trustee. He had written at the bottom of the letter, in underlined ink, "My girl, you have always been stronger than you think. When the time comes, remember that." I had put the letter away. For 3 years, I had not wanted to believe the time would come. Now I sat in Marjorie's office on a Wednesday afternoon, and I slid the envelope across her desk and I said, "It is time." Marjorie read quietly. She did not ask me if I was sure. She had known Thomas too well for that. When she looked up, her eyes were wet but her voice was steady, and she asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I wanted to leave. Quietly, without warning. I wanted to be gone before Graham came home from work, before Camille woke up from her afternoon nap. I did not want an argument. I did not want a scene. I had watched my mother argue with my father for 30 years and win nothing but a tired heart. And I had decided, sitting in that bedroom with the number 740,000 in my head, that I would not spend a single breath trying to convince my son of what he should already know. I wanted the locks changed the day I left. I wanted the trust's terms served to Graham and Camille in writing, through a process server, on letterhead, with Marjorie's signature at the bottom. I wanted them to understand, in a language they could not argue with, that the house they believed they were inheriting did not belong to my son, had never belonged to my son, and would not belong to my son unless I chose to make it so, and that I was not choosing to make it so. I wanted them to know, without me ever saying another word, that the debt Camille had run up was hers and hers alone, that I would not be paying a penny of it, and that any attempt to put a lien on the property would shatter itself against a trust that had been drafted by a man who had loved me enough to see 3 years into a future he would not live to witness. Marjorie took notes. She made phone calls. She arranged for a small, quiet place I could rent, month to month, in a seniors' community in Barrie, with a view of the bay and a little garden plot out back where I could plant tomatoes in the spring. She arranged for a mover. She arranged for a locksmith. She arranged for everything, because that is what Thomas had paid her to do, long before I ever knew I would need it. I took 11 days to get ready. Every afternoon, when Camille was at her bar class and Graham was at work, I packed a single box and drove it to a storage unit I had rented in the next town over. I took the photo of Thomas and me first. I took my mother's china, wrapped in tea towels. I took the quilt my grandmother had stitched when I was pregnant with Graham, the one I had planned to pass to my grandchildren, if I ever had any, which I was beginning to accept I would not. I took the little wooden box of letters Thomas had written me while we were courting, when he was working up north and I was finishing my library degree. I took the hand-carved chess set his father had brought back from the war. I did not take the butcher block. I could not carry it alone, and I could not bear to ask anyone to help. On the morning of the 12th day, I cooked my son a full breakfast. Eggs the way he liked them, a little runny, back bacon from the butcher in town, brown toast with the marmalade I had made myself from Seville oranges last January. I poured his coffee. I kissed the top of his head the way I had when he was a boy. He did not look up from his phone. He muttered something about a meeting. He left the house at 8:20. Camille came down at 9:30, in a silk robe, yawning. She poured herself a glass of the fresh orange juice I had squeezed and said, without looking at me, "Eleanor, have you thought any more about the timeline we discussed?" I told her, very quietly, that I had thought about it a great deal. She smiled. She assumed I meant something else. She went to take her shower. At 10:15, the movers arrived. Two of them, in navy coveralls, very polite, very fast. They loaded the last of my boxes, the mattress I had slept on beside Thomas for 37 years, the rocking chair from the nursery. Camille came down from her shower with a towel around her hair. She stood at the top of the stairs and watched, her mouth slightly open. She said, "What is happening right now?" I did not answer. I picked up my purse. I walked out the front door. I got into my car. I drove away without looking back. Marjorie's process server arrived at 2 that afternoon, while Camille was still trying to get Graham on the phone. By 4, the locksmith had changed every lock on the house. By 5, Graham was parked in the driveway in his gray Audi, staring at a key that no longer fit. I did not see any of this. I heard about it later from Marjorie, in a voice that was trying very hard not to sound amused. The first letter came on day 3. Graham wrote by hand, on a sheet of paper torn from a day planner, and he left it on the front seat of Marjorie's car because he did not have my new address. He wrote that there had been a misunderstanding. He wrote that Camille was very upset, that she had said some things she did not mean, that he himself had been under terrible stress and had spoken out of turn. He wrote that he wanted to have dinner. He wrote that he was my son, and I owed him a conversation. Marjorie read it to me over the phone. She asked what I wanted to say back. I told her nothing. I told her I had said everything I needed to say when I walked out my front door, and that the trust paperwork had said the rest. The second letter came on day 9. This one was longer. Graham wrote that the bank was calling, that Camille's creditors had somehow been notified of his address, that the house was now being looked at as a potential asset for collection, that the lawyer they had hired had told them the trust was unbreakable, and that they were at risk of losing everything. He wrote that Camille had moved out. He wrote that she had taken the dog and the stationary bike and gone to stay with a friend in Oakville. He wrote, and this is the part that made me put the phone down for a moment and look out at the bay. He wrote that he had not realized, until he was standing in an empty kitchen at midnight, that the only person who had ever cooked him a real breakfast in that house was me. The third letter came 3 weeks later. It was the shortest. He wrote only, "Mom, I am so sorry. I do not know where to begin." I did not answer any of them. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. I had spent my whole life answering Graham. I had answered him when he cried in the middle of the night as a baby, when he called from a payphone at 16 because he had run out of gas in a snowstorm, when he rang me sobbing at 36 because Melissa was gone, and he did not know how to keep breathing. I had answered every call. And somewhere along the way he had come to believe that my answering was a thing he was owed, rather than a thing I was giving. I had to let the line ring for a while before he could understand the difference. The winter that followed was the quietest of my life. I planted bulbs in my new little garden in Barrie, even though it was too late in the season, and everyone told me they would not take. I walked along the waterfront every morning. I joined a book club run by a retired professor named Helen, who made excellent shortbread and had opinions about Margaret Atwood that would peel paint. I volunteered twice a week at the local elementary school, reading with a little boy named Arjun who was learning English and who laughed the way my son used to laugh, open-mouthed and surprised, as though laughter kept catching him off guard. I was not lonely. That surprised me. I had expected to be. In March, Marjorie called to tell me that Graham had filed for bankruptcy. Camille's debts had caught up with him through the co-signing, the legal fees had finished the job, and he had lost the Audi, the condo he had kept as an investment, and most of his savings. He was living in a basement apartment in Etobicoke. He had taken a job with a smaller firm. He was, Marjorie said, a different man than the one who had stood at her desk 3 months earlier, trying to argue his way back into his mother's house. She asked if I wanted to see him. I told her I needed to think. I thought for 11 days, the same number of days it had taken me to pack my life into boxes. At the end of those 11 days, I called her back and told her yes, but on my terms, not at my home, not at his. At a diner in Newmarket, halfway between us, at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, for exactly 1 hour, Graham was already there when I arrived. He stood up when he saw me. He had lost weight. His hair was grayer than I remembered, though it had only been a season. He did not try to hug me. He did not try to cry. He waited until I had sat down and the waitress had brought us coffee, and then he said very simply, "Mom, I know there is nothing I can say that makes any of this okay. I am not here to ask for anything. I just wanted to tell you to your face that I was wrong about everything, and that I am sorry." I listened. I drank my coffee. I let him sit in the silence for a moment, because silence is a thing my generation understood that his seems to have forgotten. Then I told him the truth. I told him I forgave him. Not because he deserved it, not yet, but because I had no intention of carrying the weight of him for the rest of my life. Forgiveness, I said, is not the same thing as return. I told him I would not be letting him back into my house. I told him I would not be lending him money. I told him that if he wanted a relationship with me, it would be a small one, built slowly, over months and possibly years, in coffee shops and on phone calls, and that it would be contingent on him becoming the kind of man his father had been, which was a man who took care of his own messes and did not ask his mother to mop them up. I told him that I loved him. I told him that love was not an ATM. I told him that if he ever spoke to me again the way he had spoken to me in my own kitchen last autumn, I would stand up from whatever table we were sitting at, and I would walk away, and I would not come back. He nodded. He had nothing to say. For the first time in perhaps 20 years, my son had nothing to say, and I understood that this was the sound of him finally listening. We have coffee once a month now. Sometimes he calls on a Sunday, and we talk about small things, the weather, a book I am reading, the tomatoes in my garden plot, which did not come up last spring but came up beautifully this year. He does not ask about the trust. He does not ask about the house, which sits quiet and closed up, the lawn mowed by a young man I pay through Marjorie's office. He has not mentioned Camille in almost a year. I do not ask. I am turning 69 this October. I am going to spend my birthday at the cottage in Muskoka, by myself, the way Thomas and I used to spend our anniversaries when Graham was small and we could not afford a sitter. I will make a pot of tea. I will sit on the dock. I will watch the loons come in at dusk. If you are a woman my age, and you are reading this because something in the title caught you, because something in your own life feels too much like the story I have told, I want to say this to you, plainly, and then I will stop talking. You do not owe anyone your silence. You do not owe anyone your home. You do not owe anyone the years you have left. Love is a thing you give freely, but it is not a thing anyone is entitled to take. A son who asks his mother to pay his wife's debts is not a son who loves her. He is a man who has mistaken her kindness for a line of credit. A daughter-in-law who treats you like furniture in your own living room will never become family, no matter how many Sunday dinners you cook. Find a good lawyer while your hands are still steady. Tell someone you trust where the papers are kept. Keep one suitcase packed in a closet, just in case. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it because my husband said it to me, in a letter I did not open for 3 years, and I wish I had opened it sooner, and I wish I had not needed it at all. I did not disappear that morning to punish my son. I disappeared because I had finally understood that I was the only person in that house who still remembered who I was. And when you remember who you are, truly remember, there is nothing left to do but walk out the door and go find her.